there's just to finish the road, and in a second I'll just open it up for questions. But before I do, I just want to say one final word in conclusion, and to ask one final question in conclusion of what does this all mean, and where do these roads lead, and which roads China going to take, bearing in mind the complexity and the hope and the despair and the contradictions and the fault lines that I saw as I travelled across China. And I have to say that having lived in China for 6 years, of course we all know that we don't know everything about China. We know that we can never understand everything about China. But when you've been in China for a while, I suppose you perhaps get a little bit complacent and you think you know the story. I'd go to the countryside from Beijing, often for just a day or two, and then I'd come back to my comfy apartment and my cable television. And I kind of thought I knew about the countryside. But when I finished this journey, 2 months in the countryside, occasionally popping up onto the islands of prosperity in the urban areas, I must say I was much more negative than when I set off about the problems that China has to surmount in order to really go on to be the great power that it wants to be. And I felt rather negative rather concerned actually about the future of China. Everyone was angry about taxation in the countryside, the rural areas, the land grabs, officials are stealing peasants' land, the healthcare system has collapsed in the rural areas. Everyone was really very angry, everyone I spoke to in the rural areas. Amazingly, at the end of last year when I did this Yellow River trip, 2 years after I took the road trip, I went and asked the same questions, and a lot of people said it's much better. The government has scrapped the agricultural tax, the centuries-old tax of giving your grain to the emperor. The government has responded. It's pouring money into the healthcare system. It's responded again to the anger of the peasants. Of course, a lot of this is the interests of self-preservation. The Communist Party knows that it needs to keep the peasants happy. But it's also, of course, because many people in the government do want life to get better for the farmers. My concern is, though, that the structural issues are still the same. The structural problems are still the same. They've bought themselves a bit of time by pouring money into this project to build the so-called new socialist countryside. But the underlying problems are the same. I think China is a lot more fragile and a lot more brittle than it seems from the outside. I feel as I travel around China, even now with these improvements in the countryside, I feel something's got to give. I feel, who knows what will happen, but it feels as though you've got a 21st century economy, you've got a 21st century society in some places, in the urban areas, but the rural areas have been completely left behind, and on top of that you've got a 1950s political system. And so, just to conclude, I'd like to finish off with just one word to throw into this. Finally, just to say the need for political reform. That's one of the big issues. We can discuss that in the questions. Sorry, I've gone over my time. But the one word to throw into this, finally to finish, is the word history. Something that I know you emphasize very strongly here, and rightly so. If you don't understand Chinese history, then you're never going to understand China. And my fear is that the Chinese history has always been about collapse, reunite, get invaded, collapse, reunite. Why should the future be any different? And my answer is the only way I think that it might be transformed, or one of the only ways, is through the roads and railroads, through the development of the middle class, through people coming to the cities, through the mobility along the China Road. And so I just think that provides a release valve from the pressure cooker of rural areas in China that did not exist in past generations. And it may be this, and of course I hope it's this, for the sake of the Chinese people, I hope it's this that means that China can make some kind of transition when the crunch comes, which I do believe must happen, some mini crunches along the way. in order to enable China just to escape the cycle of history, that Chinese history does not end up just repeating itself all over again. Thank you very much indeed.